Thank you so much for being here today. I'm Amber Ledberry, the Outreach Coordinator at Climate Action Now. It will be just a few moments while people continue to gather. While we're waiting for everyone to join, I invite you to answer the icebreaker question that you'll see pop up on the screen in just a moment. All right, the question is, where are you joining from? And when it comes to climate progress, what do you wish we had better data on? Thank you, Kaylee. If you're feeling up for it, please also share your video so we can all see each other. We will be recording this event and it will be available publicly online. If you do not wish to appear in any shared content, please keep your camera off. We will send out the recording after this event. I'm very grateful that everyone is here today because even though the news has been upsetting lately, there's still hopeful information about the climate. People just don't hear enough about it. So thank you for joining us today to get your February monthly dose of climate hope. I'll now turn things over to Kaylee Beam, Director of Content at Climate Action Now.
All right. Thank you so much, Amber. So like she said, thank you so much for being here. I'm Kaylee Beam, Director of Content at Climate Action Now. And I always love seeing answers to our little icebreaker question pour in. We've got people joining us from all over the country, someone joining us from Canada, which is amazing. And when it comes to things people want to see more data on, we've got the healthcare impact of greenhouse gas emissions, super pollutants like methane, and more comprehensive data on ocean temperatures. That's awesome. So just keep those answers coming. We love to see everything that you're personally interested and passionate about. And the good news is that you'll learn a lot of hopeful data-based information today. So before we transition into the live interview, it's my job to get us warmed up by taking an action together, inspired by our featured speaker's work. And if you've been to any of our recent events, you know just how excited we are about our new tool, the Can Action Carousel. And that's what we'll be using to take one action together today. So this web-based version of the Climate Action Now app makes it easy to send well-researched, personalized messages to business leaders and political decision makers. It offers an endless stream of actions, measures your personal impact, and lets you earn points toward the planting of real trees. And the best part is that any environmental organization, local chapter of a larger group, or community group that wants to scale up their impact can get one, regardless of whether they have their own website or not. So now I'm going to share my screen and show all of you just how easy it is to take action with the carousel. So here is today's action. Tell your members of Congress to support no-till farming. And as you will see, it only takes 3 clicks to take an action. First, you click do it now, do it again. So I was testing this earlier, and so I already took this action today, but we're going to contact a different representative this time. So I'm going to click this do it again button. I'm going to skip Alex Padilla because I reached out to him earlier today. And as you can see, I have the option of choosing how I want to reach out to the decision maker I'm contacting. In this case, I'm going to say I'm going to send an email. And because the carousel has my address, it knows who my federal, state, and sometimes local officials are, depending on where you live. And as you can see, here's the message. You can pop it out and edit it if you want. But if it looks good to you, just hit that send message button and you've taken action. It's that easy. Earlier, I mentioned earning points toward a real tree, and so far, the Climate Action Now community has actually planted over 420,000 trees together, which is pretty incredible. So for those of you who want to access the carousel on your computers, I'm going to actually put a link to today's action in the chat, but if you'd just like to quickly take action on your phones, then I've got a QR code for you. So we'll hop over here. You should be seeing that now. All right, so if you want to use the QR code, just get your phone out, point your camera at it, wait for that pop-up to appear, and tap on it to get to the carousel. Of course, if you've never used the carousel, you'll have to put in some basic information to take action, like your name, address, and email. You'll also be encouraged to set that personalized message. And for those of you who already have app accounts but are using the carousel for the first time, don't worry, you won't have to start from scratch. When you enter your email, you should receive a verification code. And once you do that, all of your progress from the app will be preserved and it will transfer that over to the carousel. Okay, that's enough from me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but turn my camera into the action slide so that you can still access it. And now I'm going to hand things back over to Amber to introduce our speakers and get things started. Over to you, Amber.
Thank you so much, Kaylee. Today, Sam Matty, the editor-in-chief at Climate Action Now, will be talking with our expert guest speaker, Hannah Ritchie. Sam authors the Dose of Climate Hope's Substack newsletter for Climate Action Now. Dose of Climate Hope illustrates new technologies, policy solutions, people, and trends that give us reason to be hopeful about the climate. Dr. Hannah Ritchie is a leading environmental data scientist and writer who works at the intersection of environmental change, technology, and global development. She serves as deputy editor and science outreach lead at Our World in Data, and she is a senior researcher in the program for global development at the University of Oxford. Dr. Ritchie focuses on long-term changes in the environment, energy, pollution, agriculture, food supply, and their compatibility with global development. She completed her PhD in geosciences at the University of Edinburgh and has authored two deeply hopeful books, Not the End of the World and Clearing the Air. You can find out more of her writing on her Substack, Sustainability by Numbers, and she also co-hosts the Solving for Climate podcast with Rob Stewart. We'll now transition into our live interview. As you hear from Hannah and Sam, please type any questions you'd like to contribute to the discussion into the chat. Over to you, Sam.
Dr. Ritchie, it is an incredible honor to speak with you today. I have been writing about climate and environment news for years. I've been excited about the incredible underreported progress happening in fields from renewable energy to agricultural productivity for years. And your work has been fundamental in shaping my worldview. Like you have produced some of the best like global data analysis on such a wide variety of topics. It's genuinely awe-inspiring, and I am super excited to be able to talk with you in person today.
Oh no, that's
So,
great. Thank you very much for the intro. Yeah, and it's great to be here. Like really looking forward to the conversation and also the 100+ people in the chat that are here to talk about how we solve some of these problems.
all right, all right. Someone just said I'm muted for them. I just saw someone in the chat saying I'm muted. Pretty sure I'm not muted from But all right, here's hoping most people can continue to hear me. But um, so to start with, just one of them, just to get the meta framework for all the specific numbers we're talking about. One of my all-time favorite articles of yours is the one you wrote near the end of last year about breaking the development environment trade-off. And you point out that technically, in a sense, like most of human history was more sustainable in the sense that we had a much lower impact on the environment, but it wasn't a kind of life we want to sustain. Life was nasty, brutish, and short, to copy the sort of the classic Hobbesian quote. Like, child mortality was 50%. Half of all children died before the age of 5. We lived slavery and human sacrifice were widespread in many cultures at many different times. We sort of can view that as positive environmentally, but definitely not from a human perspective. Those sort of Iron Age and beyond sort of subsistence agricultural-based societies that have dominated so much of recorded history. And what you point out is the Industrial Revolution has massively improved human living standards across the board. But now, with the dawn of renewable energy and sort of a new basis for a technological civilization, we are not really at the end of things like so many sort of doom paradigms have it, but we have a chance to be the full sustainable generation, the first generation to have like the benefits of modern technological society with a substantially lower environmental impact, thanks to the range of amazing new technologies and processes that are emerging. So could you just elaborate on that? Because I find that to be an incredibly powerful and inspiring vision.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I come from an environmental background. That's what I studied at university. It's what I wanted to do when I was a kid. And I think if you look at history purely through an environmental lens, what you probably see and what you think, and then you look at the trends, what you see is just the world has become much less sustainable, right? Like if you look at any environmental metric, it looks like the hockey stick curve, right? So I think that leads people into the conclusion that, just everything's getting worse, right? But actually, when you step back and look at the human development indicators like child mortality, like poverty, like hunger, many of the kind of fundamental human development metrics that we value, actually the opposite is true, right? So for actually most of human history, those living standards were very poor. Like the example you gave was child mortality, where there's the chart here. For like most of human history, basically until the last few centuries, half of children would die before reaching puberty, right? And that's just a kind of level that to us today is completely unthinkable. So when we look over the last few centuries, actually we've made huge progress on these human development indicators, whether it's child mortality, and this is not just a kind of rich country story like, oh, it's fallen in the UK or the US, but countries in sub-Saharan Africa or India, for example, are really far behind. No, these child mortality rates have fallen everywhere across the world, just at different rates and different stages. So overall, on a human development lens, things have got much better. And you could argue that actually our increasing environmental unsustainability has been the driver of that, right? Like access to energy, which is mostly driven by fossil fuels, expanding land for agriculture so we have enough food, has actually driven this human development, but at the expense of the environment. So these two kind of things have been in opposition actually for most of human history. Like if you picture it as a kind of scales, for most of human history, it was tipped in that direction. Then very recently, it's tipped in this direction. And kind of the argument I put forward is I think we have this opportunity to kind of be some of the first generations that bring that back into balance. Like, I think it is possible for us to continue to increase human development and human flourishing while also reducing our environmental impact at the same time. And if we can achieve that, it's a very kind of unique thing throughout human history. I think what I always emphasize there is that we have the opportunity to do this. That does not mean that's inevitability that it happens, right? In order to make it happen, we actually need to make it happen. I guess which links in with everyone on the call because they're here because they actually want to drive things forward and actually act.
Yeah, absolutely. And one more graph from your brilliant article on this. One of the things that is putting us in this position, what you wrote is the unique position of potentially being able to improve human well-being while reducing environmental impact at the same time, is the growth of renewable energy. And we have seen just an unbelievable exponential growth in renewable energy. It's particularly solar, but also wind and increasingly battery power as well, across the world, driven by technological developments around the world and lately increasingly driven by mass manufacturing in China, that has just been hitting ridiculously high numbers around the world and is already starting to lead to lots of countries experiencing economic growth and reducing CO2 emissions. So you've commented on how a recent Emble report, which I've also written a lot about, described this as the electrotech revolution, like on the scale of the industrial revolution in terms of just a massive upgrade for civilization in how it gets its energy and how much energy it can access. So with that sort of philosophical background we discussed, what are your thoughts on just how big a deal is the rapid rollout of renewable energy, particularly solar power, that we've seen in recent years?
Like absolutely crucial. I mean, the fundamental to human development has been the story of energy, right? And we can argue about how much energy we need and whether we consume too much, but the reality is the world will need a lot of energy if people were to have high standards of living or standards of living that we would want to accept, right? And so far, most of that energy has come from fossil fuels, right? And if we want to be able to have energy without the negative byproducts of fossil fuels, which is climate change, yes, but also air pollution, right? There are other issues with fossil fuels as well. Then we need an alternative, and we need an alternative that can scale quickly, right? Like especially in low and middle income countries in the world, demand for energy and demand for electricity in particular, partly because of this electrotech revolution, is just growing really quickly, right? So you need an energy source that can grow quickly to keep up with the additional demand, but also then start to push fossil fuels out. And I guess the exciting part here is that we have one, yes, in solar and wind, but solar has actually been growing much more quickly. And solar is the fastest growing electricity source in history. Like if you look at the kind of growth rates of solar relative to coal or gas or any of these other electricity sources at that point in their development, solar is just growing much, much more quickly. And as you said, what it's actually really exciting about this is it has spin-offs, right? So there's fast solar growth is fantastic, but in order to make this work in a sustainable way, then you also need storage, the exciting thing there is that battery technology is really developing rapidly, both in terms of, I guess, the technical capabilities, but also in terms of cost, right? So you can now pair solar and batteries extremely cheaply, right? But then that goes even further, and this comes into the kind of electrotech revolution, where we're not just transforming the electricity system as it is today, we're also trying to pull more of the energy system into electricity because we now know how to decarbonize that, right? We know that we can decarbonize electricity. So you pull in transport, you pull in heating, you start to pull in industry, and then you have this fantastic system where you can actually start to transform the entire energy system, not just the electricity grid itself. And this is, yeah, as you're showing now, this is the kind of this is great work by Ember, where they kind of, it's maybe a somewhat simplistic view of history, but it kind of goes through this evolution of our ability to increase it, basically increase the amount of energy we can get from different systems. And the point there is you can get increasing amounts of energy with lower impact, right? We obviously know the impact of fossil fuels in terms of the kind of negative environmental byproducts. But before that, we had biomass, right? So we cut down forests for energy. Many people still do that today because their main energy source. I guess you can burn crops as biofuels. They're not particularly efficient, right? So it's this increasing ability to garner energy, but without the as large environmental impacts as we've had from previous revolutions.
Yeah, and that is ridiculously exciting. Like I think there's like I feel like there's a chance that like 100 or even 1,000 years from now, climate change is sort of remembered as like that problem that encouraged the development of renewable energy. Like it might like renewable the same way we might think, oh, that like that scarcity of holding animals in the Fertile Crescent in 8,000 BC, that's important because it encouraged the development of agriculture. Like we might think of the massive disruption of climate change in the far future as that thing that encouraged development of renewable energy because it opens up just so much incredible potential for civilization. It opens up so much more available energy for humanity with so much less negative environmental impact that the possibilities are just breathtaking.
Yeah, and I think this actually matters quite a lot for how we discuss and frame it, right? Like, I think everyone on this call is probably really motivated to act on climate change. I guess that's why you're here. Um, Many people are, but not quite as excited as you are. And some people just aren't, right? And that's the reality. But actually, what's going on here is actually much bigger and much more exciting than, I don't know, just tackling climate change. And I say that in a non-flippant way, which is that I think sometimes when we discuss it, we can discuss it as a very simplistic, well, fossil fuels are bad because they're driving climate change. We'll just replace that with something else, right? And we need to do that, but that just sounds a bit boring, right? And actually, the reality that we're actually grappling with here is a bit more exciting in terms of like this entire kind of energy restructuring, how we think about how it's produced, where it's transported, how we consume it, when we consume it, what you can stack on top, is actually much more intricate and more interesting than just the simplistic thing of we'll replace the bad stuff with the good stuff, which I think is sometimes how we discuss this in climate conversations.
Yeah, this is really something I'm trying to get across in my writing, just how cool it is that we now have like sheets of glass that you can point at the sky and get free electricity. Like it's it's like it's like we think of it as mostly avoiding the bad thing, right? And it is, and it's the big thing that might save us from climate change, and it's really important in that respect, but it's more than that. Like it's not just avoiding dystopia, it's potentially building utopia or build to massively oversimplify. Or, it's not just the parachute that stops us from dying when we fall off the cliff. It's like a jetpack or a dragon or something that is way cooler than just not falling. It means you can go amazing new places. Like, there's just incredible potential.
Yeah,
And
I think the one of the quotes I like to use is from Jenny Chase. She's the kind of solar queen at Bloomberg, and probably knows the most about solar power and prices and markets than anyone else. And she just makes the comparison that the cost of putting solar power, you could like build a fence basically out of solar panels that's actually just cheaper than putting up a fence, right? Like
solar panels are now cheaper than wood.
yeah,
Yeah.
which is just an incredible transformation.
Yeah, it is. And it is unbelievable. And there's just so much, and you can put that on rooftops. You can put that in deserts. You can co-locate that with agriculture. There have been tons of amazing new studies about agrivoltaics actually increasing productivity. I'd love to see an article from you like summarizing all of that recently. I don't know if there's probably not enough data yet, but like there's studies coming out showing that like putting solar panels in the desert actually increases biodiversity in many cases because it provides some shade that retains more moisture in the soil for plants. There's just an incredible array of just positive benefits. It's a win-win-win-win-win-win-win. And and I'd love to ask you, like, with your sort of global data view of the world, what have you seen so far? And I'm thinking particularly of your articles recently on your on Substack recently on global carbon emissions and on sort of the rundown on the statistics from China. What have you seen recently on how this electrotech revolution is starting to impact sort of top level figures in terms of the world on the ground today, in terms of humanity's energy consumption and emissions?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the most exciting change over the last year is that there are, I mean, everyone likes to predict a peak, and we all like to get the peak right, right? And everyone's waiting for the peak in global emissions. But actually, what really determines the peak in global emissions is the peak in China's emissions, right? And there's lots of debate of when China's going to peak. But I think some of the most exciting data over the last year has been that China's CO2 emissions have not increased over the last year or 18 months. And that is really in large part to the fact that it's building clean power so quickly, right? Like this electricity demand is growing quickly. And I think people don't have a sense of how quickly it's growing. So every year it's adding about a UK-sized electricity grid in terms of demand, right? But the fact that it's managing to keep up with that additional demand through the building of solar and wind is actually just quite incredible when you think about the scale of this. So its growth in clean power demand has been enough to basically make up for that electricity demand and start to push fossil fuels out. And I think that's the first like very, very exciting sign that this is happening. China's did not grow its fossil fuel use for electricity last year either, which was more surprising perhaps than China, because I would expect that India's emissions would go up for longer than China's because it's a bit earlier in its journey. But these big, large emitters and large economies starting to look like they might peak in emissions is just really, really crucial for the global trend. And this is really largely in part to this massive build out of clean power. But also in China's case, coming back to this kind of electrotech revolution, it's the build out of electrification, especially in terms of transport, right? So China's going extremely quickly in the rollout of electric vehicles. You know, more than half of its new sales, car sales are electric, which is way, way ahead of markets like the US, even the EU. So it's going extremely quickly on this kind of electrotech stack. And I think you're now starting to see this in its national numbers in terms of emissions and fossil fuel use. And that largely filters through into the global numbers.
Yeah, like this is something that and I'm guessing most of the people on this call living in countries that have made big bets on fossil fuel infrastructure in the past, in the US, in Western Europe, don't always see. A lot of the world gets to leapfrog over the fossil fuel age now. Like for a lot of people around the world, the first electricity they've ever had is from solar panels. It's not a replacement. It's a building clean energy from the ground up in places like rural India and now increasingly Africa.
Yeah, I think it's like another kind of exciting trend over the last, in particular, the last year or 18 months has been, you know, China's going extremely quickly on clean energy domestically, but it's also just seeing this, I guess, as the global transition, right? And it's wants to play a huge role in terms of getting market share from that. So its exports of these technologies are really quite huge and growing as well. And you've seen kind of a rapid export of solar panels. Like you saw the examples in Pakistan maybe about 18 months ago, where there was large exports to Pakistan. I remember it was interesting. People were then looking on Google Earth to see if they could see more solar panels going up in Pakistan, and you could actually see this stuff actually appearing on people's roofs. And then increasingly in sub-Saharan Africa. And coming back to this question or the kind of this framing we were talking about earlier, like people in sub-Saharan Africa just have this challenge of like most people there are very energy poor, and that's just the reality, and monetary poor as well, and they need power, right? And they will just take cheap power, as we all would. Like if someone's offering cheap power, you'll take it. And I guess the exciting thing there is that now it's just solar, right? Which gives them this combined opportunity to alleviate energy poverty, increase standards of living, but do it in this very different pathway from the pathway that countries like the UK or the US followed, where it was very, very coal dominant.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm just pulling up this graph to illustrate
Mm.
what you're saying, that now that solar's the cheapest electricity in history, it's starting to spread like crazy across Africa.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think
So
this and it's like for a lot the I guess the exciting part is like how steep the curve is, right? This chart maybe looks like the timeline is, I don't know, 20 years, but it's actually just going from 2021 to 2025, and nearly all of the growth is basically in the last year, right?
yeah,
So it's the speed of the transition that I think is really exciting.
and that's a utopian thing to be happening. Like solo. That's an abstract, that's subjective, etc. But it's very easy to feel just deep horror and despair when looking at the news, especially the political news. I feel it myself often. But the fact that solar panels are spreading like crazy in Africa is like a top 10 bullet point list things happening in the planet that are really, really important item. And it doesn't get covered much because it looks like someone in rural Nigeria being able to afford solar panels, but it's a really big deal. It's a really, really big deal.
No, it's huge. I think I think the imports of these panels are great. I think there are downsides, not necessarily downsides to that, but I think um, combined with that, I think what you're seeing at the moment is individual households being able to afford the imports of solar power, which is fantastic and fantastic for those households. I think what's also really crucial to emphasize is that within many of these poorer African economies, you also need this kind of industrial base of energy production, right? So I think you can have this very decentralized model where someone has solar and maybe they even have a battery and that works very, very well. But you also at a national level need to be able to build a kind of industrial base, build public services, etc. And that requires also some centralized energy as well. So I think these trends are super exciting. And I'm also a little bit cautious about making sure that you actually get the kind of grid systems and systems that we take for granted here in terms of public services. I think there needs to be that combination of this decentralized kind of household power, which is fantastic for those households, but also this more centralized power source to be able to power industry, public services, and stuff that I think we take for granted.
Yes, absolutely. I absolutely agree. And this is a bare minimum. Like getting some solar panels to some households is not as much as you want for a full sort of lifestyle that can give people the support they deserve. But it's more than they had 10 years ago. It's not these solar panels going to places that we're not getting any reliable sources of energy. So it's a big step in the right direction.
For sure. I think when in terms of the kind of human well-being development benefits to energy, there's obviously some diminishing returns, right? And for
Yeah.
people near the bottom of that curve, even just getting a few hours of solar power a day or power a day just is this hugely kind of life-changing relative to like a small increase for us is probably not that significant. But for someone at these very low levels of consumption, it means they have lighting or it means that they can power an electric fan because it's really hot during the middle of the day or like these small what seem like small amounts of power are actually really fundamental to people's well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. And one chart of yours, I'm just going to pull it up because it was one of the most encouraging charts I've seen in a long time that you highlighted recently. Was that one thing that a very small amount of power can power is one phone, maybe even just one flip phone per village that can bring you early warning of climate disasters, like what we've seen in Bangladesh with the national rollout of early warnings that has reduced deaths immensely from cyclones hitting Bangladesh, even as the cyclones have gotten more powerful due to climate change. So this is just such a really interesting, like counterintuitive thing that like hundreds of thousands of people died from a Category 3 cyclone in Bangladesh in the 70s, and only like orders of magnitude less than that, no more than 200 per storm, have died despite multiple Category 4 and 5 cyclones in the 2010s. So could you discuss your process behind this chart and your overall thoughts on sort of disaster resilience? Because I found this is one of your charts that blew my mind in a good way the most.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, when we think about I guess, increasing risks from climate change and disasters more broadly. I think we largely focus on the size of the hazard, right? And by the size of the hazard, I mean, the strength of the hurricane or the amount of precipitation in the flood or how severe the drought is. And that's a crucial input into these systems. But what actually matters for, I guess, the human impacts is these other two components that we talk about in this kind of Venn diagram of disaster risk. And one of them is exposure, right? So, the number of people that die or the number of people that are impacted by a disaster is also just a factor of how many people are exposed, right? So how many people are in the way of the hurricane, how many people are living on the floodplain, how many people are living on the coast that might get swamped by sea level rise. So there's an exposure component, and then there's the kind of resilience component, which is how resilient are those communities or people in basically the way of the hazard. And we mainly focus on the first one, like how big is the hazard or how bad is the hazard going to be? But this resilience component is just really, really crucial. And I think you can see it here where, Bangladesh gets hit by cyclones a lot. They're often extremely large, and this has been throughout history. But what you've seen, especially over the last decade or two, is this massive shift in resilience. And that's largely through what we might frame as like relatively simple stuff, but really kind of life-changing stuff in terms of protecting people. So here it's actually just sending warnings out to people that there's a cyclone coming, therefore they need to take shelter and be safe from the hurricane. That wasn't happening in the 1970s, which is why you had hundreds of thousands of people dying from what is actually a relatively moderate cyclone compared to some of the latter ones that were much, much stronger. So basic stuff like having a kind of disaster plan in place so people know what to do when it occurs, being able to communicate and say, like, this is coming, prepare for it, having disaster response after the disaster. Like all of this stuff seems quite basic, but is really, really crucial, and as you can see, can save tens or hundreds of thousands of lives when these disasters hit. And it's not just a story of Bangladesh. Like, this is really, really crucial across the world. Like, we need to tackle climate change and limit the size of the hazard, right? But the reality is that we will just have to deal with climate disasters, and we will have to do that for some time. So also increasing this resilience component, which is partly a factor of not living in poverty, having resilient buildings, all of this kind of stuff is really, really crucial for reducing the number of people that are impacted.
Yeah, that is a really, really important point. And like you said, a lot of things that we really take for granted in developed countries, like literally any advance warning at all that there's going to be a storm can be incredibly crucial in saving a huge amount of lives. And relatedly, one other thing that I really love, one other thing that I really love for you to discuss is how, due to sort of similarly to the Bangladesh story, even as the conditions have gotten worse, resilience has gotten better in staple crops, in global harvests of the core grains that provide like a majority of humanity's calories: corn, wheat, soybean, sorghum, rice, and to a lesser extent millet. You have a great chart here about how in 2025 many of these crops actually hit record highs despite sort of really substantial climate disruption. And that is really interesting because there's more and more stories. There was a great article about no-till farming in Canada recently that shows, like, despite way worse conditions, many farmers in many places are getting record high outputs because they're innovating. They're using new methods of farming, new seeds, new genetically modified crops, new harvesting methods, all sorts of stuff that leads to higher productivity. So could you tell me more about this?
Yeah, I mean, this is data that I like to follow very closely because I think food production is the area and nutrition is the area where I'm actually probably most concerned about the impacts of climate change. Like changes in climate, whether that's changes in temperature, changes in precipitation patterns, whether that's flooding or drought, like can all have a severe impact on the productivity and the output of specific crops. So it's something I'm very worried about, which is why I follow the data so closely, right? But actually, what you've tended to see is that, especially over a longer period of time, especially the last 60 years, you've seen this kind of rapid increase in global yields across the world. which has been very impressive. But even when you're looking, in the last few years, where we have had temperatures 1.5 degrees or so, we've still continued to see at a global level and generally an increase in production and yields of these crops. And that's not necessarily because climate isn't playing some role in pulling down yields or impacting production in some regions, but it's that the production or yields of these crops is not only determined by climate, right? So other factors also play a role in terms of the yield that you get, whether that's, access to irrigation, whether that's more resilient seed varieties that are more drought resistant or more temperature tolerant. Inputs such as fertilizers, where well used, are have been really, really crucial here. And what this is just to say is that, these other factors that we've worked and innovated on so far have offset any of the negative impacts that you would otherwise see through kind of negative impacts of climate change. So far, sometimes I often view this as a race. I view this as a race in terms of disasters. Like, can we adapt faster than the increasing creep of risks? And the same with food production. Like, can we adapt our agricultural systems at a faster pace than the negative impacts of climate change might kick in? And at a global level, so far, the story has been that we've been doing okay in this, right? We are producing more food generally year on year.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And speaking of a waste, something else that has been really interesting to me, and I'd love to know your thoughts on this. This is obviously a deeply sort of emotionally and politically sensitive issue for a lot of people, but just in terms of the numbers, um, human population projections have changed a lot recently. Global sort of number of children per family, global fertility rates have dropped immensely across the board. China's population has been shrinking since 2023. Most of the world is now well below replacement fertility rates. And one economist, Jesus Villanueva, I believe, is now projecting that a total peak in living humans might come as soon as the early 2050s. So do you think that is a major input in terms of sort of sustainability during climate disasters, or is that more just a parallel thing that's not really going to, like, is potentially fewer humans just reducing the total amount of food we need to produce an important factor in that way you're discussing, or is this more just a different thing that is just also happening?
I mean, if you look over the course of the 20th century, you saw very rapid population growth there. And there were lots and lots of concerns throughout the 20th, and in particular, the 60s and 70s was the kind of big boom period. Paul Ehrlich wrote this book, The Population Bomb, and there was lots of fears at the time that population growth was just going to completely outstrip our ability to produce enough food. And there was, predictions of widespread famine, and those just didn't come true. And those didn't come true for two reasons. One is that we got increasingly good at producing food, I think beyond people's expectations. So we managed to generate a lot of food. And at the same time, population growth rates rapidly slowed down relative to what people were thinking that they would be. And that's largely because generally you see this pattern that as economies develop, the number of children per family reduce, right? So throughout most of history, it would have been 5 or 6 children per woman. Some countries in the world, especially poorer ones, are still at that kind of level of fertility rates, like 4 or 5 children per woman. But many countries are now converging on 2 or less, right? Now, China's now down at 1 in its total fertility rates. Some countries are below 1. So you've seen this really rapid reduction in fertility rates, which has changed our expectations of how rapidly the global population would change. So for these two reasons, despite, quite rapid increase in global numbers, we've still managed to produce more food per person than we did 50 years ago, right? And that's been generally very positive. I think looking into the future, I think I think now that global population growth rates are much, much slower than they were in the past. I think the total number that we end up, whether that's 9 billion or 10 billion, if I'm honest, I don't think it makes a huge difference. And I think that might seem a bit extreme, but I think there are other factors in our food system and our kind of energy system more broadly, which I think will have a much bigger impact than just whether it's 9 billion or 10 billion. Like, I think some of the bigger transformations that you would expect to see over the next 50 or 60 years, which I think will have actually a bigger impact on food availability, is actually dietary change, right? So as I said, we can now produce more food per person than we did 50 years ago. But I think people don't have a sense of how large that is, right? We can actually produce 6,000 kilocalories per person per day, right? So like 2 to 3 times the actual amount that we need for 8 billion people, right? The what's actually going on there is that we currently have like a pretty wasteful food system in terms of actually taking those calories that we grow and actually getting them to people. And a big part of that is animal agriculture. So we basically take food, we feed it to animals. It's a very inefficient process. So you don't get a lot of, so for a cow, for example, for every 100 calories you put into a cow, you get maybe 3 calories out in terms of beef, right? Chicken is the best animal in terms of that efficiency, and you're still only getting 12, maybe, right? So you're still losing almost 90% of the calories you put in. So you have this kind of huge losses across this food chain. So I actually think what might have a bigger impact on, the number of calories that are available to feed 9 or 10 billion people, depending on where we end up, is actually the transformation in terms of dietary change, right? If we were to shift much more from meat and dairy to a more plant-based diet globally, you could ultimately have either a huge amount more calories available, or you could actually just use less land for agriculture and kind of give that back to nature or grow forests or do other stuff with it. To me, that seems like the transformation which will have a bigger impact on food availability and food production than whether it's 9 or 9.5 or 10 billion people ultimately.
Yeah, so if I, just to sort of gloss that and summarize that, it sounds to me like this just that our food system's doing a lot better than people expected as recently as sort of the 60s and 70s era when people were worried about imminent famine, and also this immense sort of opportunity to make it much better. Like we are currently hitting record high crop yields despite climate disruption. We are currently hitting record high amounts of calories produced per person, and human population's likely to peak soon, and there's an opportunity to have a much, much more efficient food system if we can just have much more efficient ways of eating calories in terms of plant-based diets instead of the inefficient transfer into meat. So it sounds like there's just a lot of upside, so to speak, in the current food system, a lot of opportunities to use what we have more efficiently, and also we are getting really good at producing a vast amount.
Yeah, I think that's broadly true. Like I think we can definitely produce enough for everyone, right? Distribution's an issue, and cost is an issue, but we can produce enough for everyone. And I think we have the potential to actually produce a much more efficient food system than we currently have. I think that's the global story. I would still note that there are particular regional aspects that I'm concerned about. Like a big focus in my work has been food production in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, where there the crop yield story has been much less positive. Yields have increased a bit on average across sub-Saharan Africa, but they're well, well, well below the global average, and that growth has not been fantastic. So in sub-Saharan Africa, you're going to have like a little bit of the opposite, where you might have this culmination of, relatively poor. Yeah, this is an article I wrote on this. So you have relatively poor crop yields currently. It's also the region where we're going to see the fastest population growth. Most of the population growth this century is going to be in sub-Saharan Africa. You're going to have climate impact put on top of that, right? So coming back to this resilience, if we cannot develop, more drought-resistant seeds or innovate on technologies that allow farmers to mitigate against these climate risks, then that's an additional factor on top of that. And actually, as I discussed in that article, there's the food production challenge there, but for many farmers or these economies as a whole, is actually just a core source of income, right? So actually, most people in sub-Saharan Africa or many countries in sub-Saharan Africa work in farming. That's their main source of income. Therefore, if you have challenges with output or you have challenges with yields, that impacts food production and food availability, but it also impacts these farmers' ability to lift themselves out of poverty, right? Then you have this challenge of, yes, food challenges, but also this, you might frame it as a poverty trap. So I think there are these culmination of issues where I think some of the regional stories are not necessarily reflected in the more optimistic global story.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that your walk in our world in data really underscores is that, sort of morally speaking, a lot of the most important questions and challenges facing humankind are in sub-Saharan Africa, because that is where a lot of the worst remaining human misery lives. That's where a lot of the remaining people stuck in extreme poverty live. That's where a lot of the remaining people with very, very low agricultural productivity that are very vulnerable to famines and droughts and floods live. That geography is the world's most vulnerable people.
Yeah, I mean, you see, if you look regionally at the kind of economic transformation, so Europe and North America had very strong economic development. In the last 50 years, many countries in Asia have had very strong economic development. South America, the same. And some, so to be clear, so there are some success stories in sub-Saharan Africa, but overall, yeah, that's now where most extreme poverty is basically living on less than $3 a day, so like very, very acute levels and serious levels of poverty. Today, that's where most people in extreme poverty live. And actually, my colleague Max Roser recently published an article saying, and if you look over the last 50 years, there's been this kind of amazing global transformation and this decline in extreme poverty. But actually, if you project out kind of economic growth rates, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, this kind of period of poverty decline is coming to an end. And actually, you start to see poverty numbers and poverty start to increase again. So I think, yeah, I think when it comes to poverty, when it comes to food availability, and many of these other factors, I think, yeah, sub-Saharan Africa tends to have the worst rates.
Yeah, and because also t tied into what you were saying, they'll also where a lot of the population growth is happening. So like this graph from this article from your Our World and your awesome Our World and Data site, we have and just parenthetically, extreme poverty is really not the same as when we talk about poverty in a developed country.
No.
That's not like can't send your kid. Extreme poverty isn't like can't buy your kid a toy poverty, although that is sad and real. It is might starve to death tomorrow poverty. So this is like a level of poverty. This is not like all poverty. This is the worst of the worst. Um,
Yeah, I mean
so
the
yeah.
kind of standard poverty line in a rich country might be equivalent to around $30 per person per day, and the international poverty line is $3 per person per day. And this is adjusted for people. When this comes up, people always say, "Well, yeah, stuff in the US is much more expensive than it is in, I don't know, Nigeria or somewhere." But all this data is adjusted for the price differences across countries. So yeah, it's the difference between $30 a day in a rich country, a poverty line, and the international poverty line is free. So it's like extremely low levels of poverty.
Yeah, and this is something that is really one of the biggest sort of questions facing the world. This potential, like we as humanity have massively reduced extreme poverty in South Asia and East Asia, massive development in China and India, massive progress in Latin America and many other places. And the question is, can we pull this off in sub-Saharan Africa despite the accelerating threat of climate change? And personally, I'm really hoping that some of the new tools we have, like cheap solar panels and malaria vaccines and stuff, will make this chart not happen. Will make sub-Saharan Africa, the line in blue, be able to decrease extreme poverty like Asia has.
Yeah, I mean, sounds very basic, but in order for this not to happen and these numbers not to start going back up, is that many of the countries that have high rates of extreme poverty today need to see very strong economic growth over the coming decades. And I think there are a couple of inputs to that. I think, as I said, many people in these countries are working in agriculture, right? So being able to increase yields, increase income from that source is a important transformation in that step. But then increasingly these countries, as they move out, if you look at East Asia or South Asia or what's happened there, there's been this kind of structural transformation that many countries go through where they move from mostly an agricultural economy to either industrial or service-based economy, and sometimes it's some hybrid, and the mix depends, but it's generally this transition from agricultural to industry or services. And industry or services needs energy, right? And I think that's where this demand for energy and this kind of structural energy at a kind of national level is really, really crucial to be able to provide these industries, to provide these jobs, and hopefully help to lift incomes.
And this is the other sort of the other gigantic problem that renewable energy might solve or might seriously help solve, in addition to fighting climate change. It might, hopefully, if as solar panels keep flooding into Africa, might provide that energy basis for standing up serious economic growth and escaping extreme poverty and escaping the subsistence agricultural trap in sub-Saharan Africa. At
Yeah,
least
I
I
mean, yeah.
hope it will.
Yeah, I mean, energy will be crucial, and the cheaper the better, right?
Yeah.
I think what's interesting about the energy transformation, and I think an interesting way to frame it is if you look at energy prices of different sources over the last century, right? What you've seen is that fossil fuels have basically not changed in price, right? They go through these kind of volatile cycles, right? So there was you saw energy prices spike several years ago when Russia invaded Ukraine. So you definitely see these volatile spikes. But if you just kind of draw the trend line, there's basically no trend, right? So it's just as cheap to pull coal or oil or gas out of the ground as it was 100 years ago, right? And what's exciting about these renewable technologies is that we're moving from the energy being a commodity, right? So stuff you dig out the ground to them being technologies. And technologies follow what we call learning curves, right? Yeah, there's a perfect example. So oil just, yeah, it goes through these fluctuations. It's maybe even got a little bit more expensive in recent years. But generally there's been no trend for over a century. And that's just like not the case with solar or wind or battery technologies. So we're now at the point where the lines are crossing, where or have already crossed, where solar or wind is now undercutting the cost of fossil fuels. But I think what's exciting about that from I guess more of an economic development standpoint is that, if you take any of the kind of fossil fuel energy sources and kind of look at the price per unit as this kind of flat line, in order to get access to the energy, you basically need to wait for your income to rise and meet the flat fossil fuel line, right? So you need, in some sense, you need to wait for this income growth to happen in order to be able to access the energy and grow it. And actually, what's a bit different about this is that you don't need to necessarily wait for incomes to come up to the fossil fuel line because the renewable line is coming down to cross the income line, if that makes sense. So you can actually cross that line of getting access to energy or getting access to increasing amounts of energy at a lower point of income than you would be if you just had this flat line of fossil fuels to work with.
Yeah, yeah, and that is incredibly exciting that we're moving this fundamental input into civilization from a commodity to a technology, from something that we just have to go out and dig more of to something that we can just keep incrementally making better and better and better.
Yeah, I mean, I
So,
think I think like it's still true that many of these technologies have their issues, right? Like these are not perfect technologies. Like they come with some downsides. That there are things that we can do to make them better. But in some sense, I think that's the exciting part, right? Like already they're pretty good, but actually looking into the future, probably this is as bad as they're going to be, right?
yeah,
Or as expensive as they're going to be. And
yeah,
and for many of the kind of alternate technologies in terms of fossil fuels, or whether you're talking about the food system, like meat and dairy, for example, these are technologies or sources that we've, been refining for well over a century or more, right? And actually, what's exciting about these new technologies is that they're still relatively new, right? And there's actually still lots of scope for them to improve and for us to work on the downsides and innovate in that way.
yeah. So that is spectacular. I've covered some of the major sort of points I wanted to share. In the last couple minutes, what would you like to share that you really think that more people should know that isn't well reported, isn't well covered by sort of the virality-driven media structures of today's internet? What is some more just really important data that you feel does not get as well known as it should?
I mean, I think there's a lot of feeling at the moment that climates or concerns about climate are taking a backseat, or even to the extent that people just don't care about climate. Like that's actually just what I hear from people a lot is especially when it comes to action, why should I care or act because no one else does? And I actually just don't think that's borne out in when you look at survey data. Like actually across most countries, people do support climate action. Like they do want to see more, they want governments to do more, they themselves are willing to do more. I think often what's lacking is Either they don't know what to do and are confused, right? So they think that, switching to X or replacing something with something else, like maybe they should do that, but maybe there are downsides to doing that, or is it too expensive? Or so there's different blockers in the way that mean that they just get confused about what it is that they should be doing or whether it's actually possible or effective to do so. And then another thing that I think is a challenge is that they think that again that no one else is doing it, so why should they do it? And again, I don't think the data necessarily bears that out. Like I think most people do care. I think what you do start to see in the data is that although lots of people care about the environment and they care about climate, for most people it's not the priority issue, right? So if you take polling data. Like in the UK, YouGov does this survey, and they've been doing it since I think 2011, where they basically ask the public to rate like what are the most pressing issues facing the country and most important issues. And environment rates pretty highly. Like it's usually like third or fourth or fifth, but it's never ever first. What's always first is cost of living and economy. Health is always very, very high on the list. Stuff like immigration fluctuates up and down. And then often it's maybe climate or environment or another issue. And I think that's really, really important. And I guess in the conversations we have around this, and I guess the narrative that we discuss this around, where yes, people are willing to take action on climate, but you need, in order to get this at a mass scale, you need to link it in with the other things that people care about and concerns that they have. So they do have concerns about how much it will cost and will electricity prices go up and will we be able to afford the energy transition. They do also care about what are the health implications of this. And there are, like we talked mostly about climate, but there's also a huge angle on air pollution when it comes to this transition. So I think a big part of the conversation also needs to be about bringing in these other issues that people really care about and are very much linked to climate action and often are higher on the priority list than just climate or environment itself.
Yeah, because like most people I think have a general willingness to try to save the environment, but it's very easy for politicians, especially on the right wing, to point at as well, elites care more about the environment than your kitchen table or whatever. But like you're saying, it is in fact the same thing. Like especially in the US now, with like renewable energy being held up in efforts to prop up fossil fuels, places that are investing heavily in renewable energy, like Australia, are now being able to give like hours of free electricity per day to their citizens with the new solar share program. Like building lots of renewable energy directly lowers people's electric bills once you've got enough to start seriously displacing fossil fuels that are subject to that price volatility you talked about.
Yeah, so I think that's really crucial for how we get people more engaged. One is I think to build a bit of the I don't know excitement factor. Like I often frame it as I think when people talk about climate, they often talk about it like often people talk about 2050 as this kind of deadline. And I think many people talk about it in terms of just how bad the world is going to be in 2050, right? And I think for many people that's just not an inspiring message to get them to act, right? I think often that makes people quite resigned and step back a bit. So how I often frame it is, rather than saying how bad will it be in 2050, think about like what world do we want to live in 2050? Like what standards of living do we want? What energy system do we want? Like what do we want the co-benefits to be like? Envision what you want the world to be like in 2050 and then work out a way in order for us to get there. So I think it is this for me it's this belief that the world can actually be a better place than it is today, both in terms of human development and environment in 2050. And it's working out how we actually get there and take action.
Yeah, and I believe, thanks in large part to the immense amount of data that you've pulled together and analyzed, that the preponderance of evidence, if we are lucky and smart and keep walking, is that the world can be a much better place for both humanity and our biosphere in the next few decades.
Yeah, I believe that too. So yeah, it's to working out how to translate that into action is the key thing.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All
So
right.
we're doing the top of the hour. Yeah, go ahead, Amber. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Ritchie and Sam. This was an amazing, hopeful conversation. Before I turn things over to Brett Walter, the CEO and founder of Climate Action Now, just a few housekeeping items. If you like what we're doing, please consider being a Climate Action Now member. Climate Action Now members are truly the backbone of what allows our small but mighty team of staff to bring you hopeful events like this. So we're grateful for any support you can offer. I also hope you will join us for future monthly Dose of Climate Hope events. Over to you, Brett.
Thank you. And Dr. Ritchie, so great to meet you. I've been looking at your work for so many years, and finally get to meet you in person and talk with you. What a treat. And thank you everybody else who's on the call and taking time, getting up so early, because Dr. Ritchie is, of course, in England, or Scotland, so we had to schedule it this way. Just here in the last minute, I want to go back to where we started, which was with the CAN action carousel. This is super important, folks, that we make it easy for people to take action. And it is so easy to do that with the action carousel from Climate Action Now. Here it is. You just go through. Al Gore's Climate Reality tested this technology with their chapters. They found that their chapter members took 29 times more actions using the CAN technology than using the conventional carousel. And what is so great, using conventional advocacy tools, what is so great about this is that any organization can have this carousel on its own website in a matter of minutes. And with just 4 lines of HTML, we have a growing group of organizations that are doing it. We call them coalition members. And it is really quite remarkable, the diversity. Now, Elders Climate, you might expect, a nonprofit, chapters of Climate Reality. Here is a wonderful group in the Greenfield Presbyterian Church in Michigan. Here's a civic organization, Green Austining, another Climate Reality. Third Act Oregon, they are gangbusters. They are thrilled with this. They're using it, and it goes on and on. We even have a Dr. Kevin Kolak's chemistry class. So when you think about who might use an action carousel, don't think just established nonprofits. Just think any group of people who are concerned about climate can have this carousel on their website. And if they don't have a website, we will publish it for them on our website, just as we have done for Third Act, and we've done it for Jessica Craven, Chop Wood, Carry Water. So this is an amazing thing. So here's Jessica Craven. Her actions are here we're hosting them for her. And then one other thing so as far as that goes, all of you belong to probably multiple groups. You may belong to a church, you may belong to a local chapter of an environmental org, other groups, League of Women Voters, right? Rotary clubs. Whatever group you belong to that's concerned about climate, please tell them about the action carousel and invite them to ask for it. It's very easy to get it. You just come to this page, and could somebody put this link in the chat for me? Amber, maybe you could do that. You just come to this page, learn more, and just fill out a little form, and Amber and I will make it so easy for you to get your own action carousel. Now, the other thing I want to make a sneak peek, an announcement here, to say that many of us woke up this morning and were greeted by the news in the New York Times that President Trump is calling for Republicans to nationalize elections. So I think most of us here understand how dangerous that would be. And I think what we're going to see is an escalation in advocacy for democracy. And you're going to be seeing that from Climate Action Now as well. And what we will be publishing very soon is a dashboard for democracy, where we will be collecting actions from Indivisible, from Jessica Craven, from Robert Hubble, other democracy advocates, putting them all in one place where people can come and, using our tool, advocate. And there'll be notifications. You'll be able to see what events are happening in your area. You can see who else is taking action. And just as with the Climate Action Now carousel, any group that wants to have the dashboard on their own website can have it just as easily, the Democracy Action Carousel. Now, so we have this wonderful tool here that is a proven tool for mobilizing citizen advocates And what we need, folks, are your support. I mean, we need volunteers to help us get the word out. We need financial support. We're a tiny team. You know, we are 10 people, most of us volunteers. I'm a volunteer. I don't take a salary for this work. We need financial support, and we need volunteers to help us push these action carousels, both for climate and for democracy, out into the country when it is most needed. So please, if you can volunteer, would you put our support email in the chat, Amber, support@Climate Action Now. Let us know you can volunteer. Speak to your climate groups, speak to your democracy groups, tell them that this tool is available to them for free. And they just have to go to that page to join the CAN Coalition. We'll give them everything they need. It literally takes minutes to get that carousel up and running on websites, or we can host it for you. So with that, thank you again, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Dr. Ritchie. Such a delight.
Thank you, Dr. Ritchie.
Thank you,
Round
Sam.
of applause for Dr.
What's
Ritchie.
happened. You guys are great. Take care.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all. Dr. Ritchie